My name is Nadia Hale, and I was 36 when I entered divorce court, expecting to lose my home, my business, and my children. My husband Daniel wanted all three. His mother had spent 10 weeks telling people at church that I was heartless, greedy, and responsible for driving a good man away. Most of Belhaven believed her. Then, moments before the courtroom doors opened, my mother leaned toward me and whispered two words that stopped me cold. 4 months after I signed everything over, every Rourke in that courtroom wished they had read the papers they had fought so hard to receive. If you enjoy quiet stories about ordinary women who stay composed when the people closest to them turn against them, leave a comment and subscribe. I needed a long time before I was ready to tell this one. I started Hale Ledger Services on an old plastic table in our garage. 11 years earlier, before Daniel and before the children, I had one small client and a used calculator with a broken 4-key. I handled the books for a hardware supplier, then a bakery, then a veterinary clinic. Slowly, more small businesses around Belhaven began bringing me boxes of receipts and their worries about the tax authorities. By the time I was 31, I had a downtown office with a pair of workstations and my name printed on the glass. The steel key I used every morning had become smooth from years of unlocking the door before sunrise. People assumed they knew what I was worth. They saw the office, the regular clients, and the reputation my father had left behind, so they imagined I had money everywhere. They never saw how narrow my margins were, or how often I fixed someone else's mistakes without charging them, because I couldn't stand watching a family lose its business over a simple accounting error. That was how I lived. I carried things. I was the accountant who found irregularities before the lender did, the friend who quietly helped cover a payroll shortage, the wife who kept the household and the business organized without asking anyone to organize her life in return. I had become so good at carrying responsibility that no one stopped to ask what it was doing to me. I didn't ask either. It took a courtroom and an unfaithful husband to show me that the same strength people depended on could also be used against me. Daniel was charming in the polished way people in sales often are. He could make you feel like the most important person in the room, then forget your name before he reached the parking lot. I married him at 26. He sold commercial machinery throughout the region, and for several years we were happy, or at least functional. The change began 4 years before the divorce, when one of Daniel's side businesses collapsed. He had put our savings and borrowed money into a partnership with a man who turned out to be running a scam. When the bills finally arrived, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table, pale and humiliated. I did what I had always done. I moved enough money through the business to cover the damage and kept the accounts documented. I thought I was helping my husband. I expected no praise. What I didn't understand was that Daniel experienced being rescued by his wife as an insult. After that, his resentment came out in little comments. "You always have to be the one who saves everything, don't you? Must be nice being the capable one." I laughed at the time and reached for his hand. Somewhere inside that humiliation, Daniel had decided my competence was a form of control. To him, every spreadsheet was another way I held power over him. He never thanked me for preventing the failure from damaging his credit. He simply began keeping score. I didn't recognize the affair at first, but when I look back now, the marriage ended the night I covered his debt. I spent another 4 years trying to balance a relationship that had already run out of value, convinced that if I worked harder, the numbers would eventually correct themselves. The clues were small enough to dismiss. Meetings that ended later than they used to. Aftershave I had never bought for him. His phone left face down on the nightstand, buzzing again and again. I need to be clear about one thing. I never searched his phone. I didn't record him, plant anything, or read his messages while he slept. I had spent my career handling other people's private information, and I knew the difference between noticing something and hunting for it. So I noticed. Serena Vale kept appearing around him. She was the real estate agent who had sold us our house on Maple Street years before. Suddenly, she was at the same cafe, the same roadside market, and the same charity walk as Daniel. I told myself I was imagining a pattern. Then, one afternoon, Daniel's phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was showering. I looked away immediately, but not before one message crossed the screen. We need to know what her father left her. It wasn't romantic. That was what frightened me. There was no "I miss you" or "I love you." It was a blunt question about my inheritance from a woman who already knew the layout of my house. I stood in my own kitchen and realized this was no longer simply about a marriage. They had turned my life into a plan. They were calculating the value of my house, my business, and the money my father had left me. They were already counting. So was I. To understand why I couldn't sleep, you have to know what was at stake. There was the Maple Street house, where Maya had taken her first steps and Owen had lost his first tooth. There was the business with my name on the door, the only thing I had ever created entirely by myself. There was my reputation in a town where the person who rings up your groceries may sit behind you at church on Sunday. And there were my children, 10 and 8, who still believed their parents were a team. That was the ledger that mattered most, not the one measured in dollars. My father, Harold, had died 6 years earlier. He left me about $210,000 and his share of a small tract of land outside town. Harold had been a bookkeeper too. When he was young, a business partner had taken advantage of him and disappeared with nearly everything. Before I was old enough to drive, he taught me one rule. "Money leaves a trail," he used to say. "If it's yours, keep that trail clean." He meant that I should keep my property separate, record where it came from, and never allow my accounts to become mixed with someone else's. When his inheritance came to me, I followed that rule exactly. The money went into an account in my name alone. No marital deposits went in. No marital withdrawals came out. Every transaction was documented in the blue ledger he had given me when I was 17. His square handwriting still filled the margins. One note appeared beside the deposit records again and again. Keep it separate. I had followed that instruction for years without ever needing to defend myself with it. I didn't know yet that it would become the only barrier between me and losing everything else. Daniel didn't tell me he wanted out. His lawyer did. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday at my office, delivered by a process server in full view of the downtown businesses. I read them alone behind my closed door. Daniel wasn't merely asking to end the marriage. He wanted the Maple Street house. He wanted a legal share of Hale Ledger Services, even though he had never worked there and had only entered the office to ask me for money. He also wanted primary custody of Maya and Owen. His attorney was Paul Rourke, Daniel's cousin on his mother's side. I didn't need anyone to explain where the strategy had come from. The papers demanded a formal valuation of my company as marital property. I sat at my desk and felt as if the floor had shifted under me. Then I did the only thing I know to do when something doesn't add up. I called a professional. Tessa Mensah had been recommended by a local business owner whose books I had once repaired. She spoke calmly and directly, which I appreciated. In about 15 minutes, I told her about the affair, the house, the company, the inheritance, and the children. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "Did any part of your inheritance ever go through a joint account?" The way she asked told me she already understood the shape of the case. "No," I said, "not a dollar." My father's voice seemed to fill the room as I answered. The inheritance had remained in its own account, under my name, untouched by marital money. Hale Ledger Services was also a single-member LLC. I had created it before Daniel and I were married, with separate books, separate tax filings, and a clear ownership record covering 11 years. Tessa put down her pen. "Then they're pursuing property that may not belong to them," she said. "Under Indiana law, an inheritance that remains separate and traceable stays separate. A business owned before the marriage can be treated the same way if the records prove it was never blended into the marriage." For the first time that day, I felt a little pressure lift. Then she leaned toward me. "But being legally right doesn't make the process painless. You have to prove every dollar's history. Their plan is to hope you became careless somewhere during those 11 years. They'll look for one blurred account, one undocumented transfer, one place where the trail breaks. While they search, they'll use delays and legal fees to wear you down. I nodded. I understood exactly what she meant. And the town? I asked. Tessa's expression tightened. The law can protect your property. It can't make people believe you. That was the real problem. My documents were strong. My father had made sure of that long before I understood why. But Miriam Rourke had already delivered her verdict in front of half of Belhaven, and people had accepted it. Miriam never needed to shout. She was 62, silver-haired, and known for bringing food to funerals and remembering everyone's birthdays. When a woman like that lowered her voice in a church kitchen, people leaned closer. I learned what she had said from other people. I was cold. I had kept Daniel on an allowance. I had hidden money from him for years. No wonder he had looked elsewhere when his wife treated him like an employee. Miriam never used the word affair. She simply left enough unsaid for everyone else to reach the ugliest conclusion on their own. Within 10 days, conversations stopped when I entered a room. A woman whose taxes I had prepared at a discount crossed the street rather than greet me. Serena stopped pretending to stay hidden. She stood beside Daniel at a school baseball game, outside the hardware store, and once at a diner where she laughed too loudly and left her hand on his arm for everyone to notice. She was already acting like the next Mrs. Rourke. She was already talking as if the house were hers to rearrange. The worst part was the loneliness. I had spent 11 years being trusted with people's money and secrets. Now that someone was taking from me, almost no one could imagine me as the person being victimized. They looked at the competent woman and assumed she must have caused the problem. Then Daniel brought the children into it. He had never been the parent who knew the pediatrician's phone number or remembered which child refused to eat crusts. Suddenly, he became the entertaining father. He arrived with a new bicycle for Owen and promised Maya a pony. He talked carelessly about all of them moving into a much better house. He made it sound as if I were the only thing standing in their way. I learned what he had been saying when Maya came home unusually quiet and asked, "Mom, are we poor now?" I knelt on the vinyl kitchen floor until we were eye to eye. I didn't cry, and I didn't criticize Daniel. I had decided from the beginning that no matter what he did, the children would not be forced to hear me destroy half of who they were. But I made a promise to myself. That night, I called Tessa and asked what I needed to do to protect them. The next morning, we requested a guardian ad litem, someone neutral whose responsibility would be the children's actual welfare. I kept Maya and Owen in the same school. Their bedtimes stayed the same. Their meals and basketball practices stayed the same. Consistency matters, Tessa told me. The court notices it. Daniel offered excitement. I offered the usual dinner at 5:30 and the same lamp glowing in the hallway at bedtime. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like holding on to two small hands while someone tried to pull them somewhere else. That night, Maya asked me again, "We're going to be okay, right?" "We are," I told her. For the first time, I made myself believe it. The annual county harvest benefit was held in the church basement, with folding tables and covered dishes filling the room. Nearly everyone in town came. I almost stayed home, but avoiding the event would have looked like an admission of guilt. I don't run from people. I wore a simple gray dress, carried a cardboard plate, and made brief conversation with people who watched me as if I were a story unfolding in front of them. Miriam had taken over the center table. Daniel sat beside her, with Serena nearby. I was pouring myself a drink when I heard someone ask how I was managing. Miriam answered loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "She'll survive somehow," she said, "though she may not even leave this marriage with the name she was born with." The people around her laughed. It wasn't a harsh laugh. That made it worse. It was the comfortable laugh of people who had already decided the comment was deserved. I placed my cup on the table and walked out. I didn't turn around to give them the outburst they were expecting. I didn't raise my voice or let them see me cry. In the parking lot, I got into my car and sat with both hands on the steering wheel. Instead of breaking down, I reached into my purse, pulled out a pen and an old receipt, and began writing. I'm a bookkeeper. When my life becomes chaotic, I audit it. That audit changed everything. I pulled the mortgage records for Maple Street, documents I had every legal right to access. 5 months before Daniel filed for divorce, he had quietly refinanced the house and opened a home equity line. Almost all the equity we had built over 11 years was gone. The money had not been placed in savings. Daniel had used it to fund a property renovation venture with Serena listed as his partner. There was something worse. To secure the business loan supporting that venture, Daniel had signed a personal guarantee. His name was responsible for the entire debt. I sat in my office with the desk lamp on and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not fury, understanding. When I first noticed the refinancing, I called the bank and tried to stop it. But the home was jointly mortgaged. Both signatures were needed to freeze the account, while one spouse could borrow against it. There was nothing I could legally do except document what had happened. So I documented everything, every statement, every transfer, every date. As the records came together, I saw what Daniel had failed to see. He thought he was collecting assets, the house, my company, and a future with Serena. In reality, he was collecting obligations. He was fighting to win a pile of debt that his own signature guaranteed. Paul Rourke made sure the divorce became expensive. That was the point. When someone can't win on the law, they try to exhaust the other person until she no longer has the money or energy to continue. He filed motion after motion. He demanded another valuation of the business, then another. He even asked for temporary spousal support to be paid by me, presenting me as the wealthy wife who had supposedly wronged Daniel. Every letter required a response. Every response cost money that should have gone toward the children. There were nights when I sat at the kitchen table around 1 a.m. with the blue ledger open and wondered whether proving the truth was worth the price. Tessa kept bringing me back to the facts. "We don't need to outshout them," she told me. "We answer every claim with records. Noise disappears. Documents stay." I kept working. I kept the office open. I tied Maya's hair before school and showed up for the children even on mornings when I felt barely functional. The exhaustion was quiet. It didn't show on my face, but it was always there. If you've ever been the person everyone depends on, the one who solves things for everyone else while nobody asks whether you're all right, then you understand that kind of tired. If this feels familiar, leave a comment saying, "I see her," and subscribe so you don't miss the rest. The next morning, I went to the bank and collected the proof that changed the case. Knowing you are right is not the same as proving it. My father had spent my childhood teaching me that difference. I went to the bank where the inheritance account had remained untouched for 6 years and requested a certified transaction history. It carried the bank's seal and showed each deposit from his estate, along with the fact that no marital money had ever entered or left the account. After that, I visited my father's former attorney. His probate file was still there, and I obtained certified copies of the will, the estate distribution, and the deed to the land outside Belhaven. From my own records, I gathered the formation papers for Hale Ledger Services, filed before Daniel and I married, along with 11 years of separate business tax returns. I placed everything in one heavy folder and drove to my mother's house. Elise was 61 and had always been difficult to fool. I put the folder on her kitchen table, opened the blue ledger, and turned to the pages where my father had written the dates of the inheritance deposits. Beside them, he had written one word: separate. The dates in the certified bank records matched his handwriting exactly. The trail from my father's estate to my account had never been interrupted. My mother rested her palm on the folder and looked at me. "Sometimes," she said, "the wisest thing you can do is let people keep the burden they were so determined to claim." I closed the folder. At the time, I thought she was trying to comfort me. She was explaining the strategy. I just wasn't ready to understand it. A few days later, I ran into Serena in the grocery store parking lot. We both reached for the same cart return, and there was no graceful way to avoid speaking. Without an audience and without Daniel beside her, she looked tired. For a moment, neither of us performed. "You think I'm the villain," she said. I didn't answer. She loaded her bags into her vehicle and continued in a quieter voice. "You have no idea what it's like to reach my age with nothing. I've walked away from more than one marriage with nothing to show for it." For a moment, I understood her. She had placed her security in 2 different marriages and watched both settlements disappear. At some point, she had decided that the only safe thing in life was an asset with her name attached to it. I knew that fear. I had seen it in clients who calculated their future and realized the numbers wouldn't support them. For one brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then she straightened and the softness disappeared. "That house is basically mine already," she said. "Daniel told me the blinds can go. I never liked them." She had stood in my home, the place where Maya had learned to walk, and decided which of my belongings should be removed. Whatever sympathy I had felt vanished. I didn't hate Serena. I didn't have the energy for that. But I stopped confusing fear with an excuse. Someone could be afraid and still choose to behave cruelly. Serena had made her choice willingly. That weekend, my mother told me something about my father I had never heard. We were washing dishes while the children slept in the next room. She handed me a plate and said, "Your father wasn't always careful with money." Before he met her, Harold had gone into business with a friend he trusted like a brother. They shook hands instead of signing contracts. They put everything into one account because that was what trust meant to him then. The friend emptied the account and disappeared. Harold had no documents showing which money was his. "He didn't only lose the money," my mother said. "He lost the evidence that could have helped him recover it." It took him years to rebuild. After that, Harold recorded everything. That was why he kept the blue ledger. That was why he taught me that money needed a clear trail. It wasn't a personality quirk. It was the result of a wound. I had always thought my father's rule was about organization. It had really been about protection. My mother dried her hands and gave me the same steady look he used to have. "Your father had another saying," she told me. At the card table, he'd say the person making the most noise usually had the weakest hand. I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I had managed in weeks. I had spent 10 weeks being drowned out by people who were risking everything. Maybe my father had understood people like them better than I did. 6 days before the hearing, Tessa laid out the case in front of me. "They're relying on 3 claims," she said. "They want the business classified as marital property. They want the inheritance treated as mixed with marital funds. And they want the house and the other marital assets divided." She counted them off with her fingers. "We can defeat the first 2. The company is separate. The inheritance is traceable. Your records are strong. But the Maple Street house, the vehicles, and the furniture are marital property. Daniel is legally entitled to fight for his share." "Then we fight for the house," I said. "We can," she replied. "We might even win." I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been forming since I found the refinancing records. What is the house actually worth now? Tessa reviewed the appraisal and the payoff amounts. She calculated the remaining mortgage, the home equity line, and the loan Daniel had guaranteed. The equity in Maple Street wasn't merely small, it was negative. The debt attached to the property exceeded its value. I leaned back as my mother's words finally made sense. Let them keep the burden they fought for. The house they wanted wasn't a prize. It was a trap they had built themselves. I made Tessa go through the figures 3 times because the results sounded impossible. I don't trust numbers that seem too favorable, but the math held. Whoever received the house would be responsible, at least between the parties, for the mortgage, the home equity line, and the other obligations connected to it. The property was worth less than the total debt. Then we reviewed the business. Daniel wanted half of Hale Ledger Services valued as an operating company. Tessa pointed out what Paul had missed. "A bookkeeping practice isn't valuable because of the room it occupies," she said. "It's valuable because clients trust the person doing the work. That person is you." Without me, there was a lease, some equipment, and filing cabinets. Even if the court somehow considered the company marital, which the records made unlikely, half of a practice without the person clients depended on would be worth very little. The clients would leave with me. That was when the entire plan became clear. They had spent money, legal effort, and the goodwill of an entire town trying to take three things: a house buried in debt, a business that had no real value without me, and children whose guardian had already noticed Daniel's limited involvement. Every part of their plan was capable of damaging Daniel more than it could benefit him. And I hadn't created a trap. They had done that on their own. I had only kept the records. The truth didn't immediately make the gossip stop. Miriam's version had been repeated so often that people treated it as fact. I was the cold wife who hid money and pushed a decent man away. I heard that she repeated the joke about my name at a women's gathering. A friend from high school, whose cafe I had helped keep open for 18 months, stopped returning my calls. That hurt more than I expected. I could have taken the records to the church basement and shown everyone what Daniel had done with the house. I could have explained the personal guarantee and the debt. Tessa advised me not to. "Keep the truth for the place where it matters," she said. "A courtroom, not a gossip circle. Once you start defending yourself against rumors, you've already accepted their rules." So I stayed quiet. Silence chosen deliberately is different from silence forced on you. Still, it nearly broke when Maya came home from school one afternoon and climbed onto the couch. A girl in her class had told her we would lose our house and have to sleep in our car. I held her and resisted the urge to promise that we would keep Maple Street. By then, I knew we were likely to surrender it. Instead, I looked directly at her. "We will always have a home," I said. "I built one once when I had almost nothing. I can build another." She believed me. Now I had to make sure I was telling the truth. In the days before the hearing, Tessa and I assembled the file piece by piece. It included the certified inheritance history, the probate documents, the company formation papers, 11 years of separate tax returns, the mortgage and refinance records, the home equity line, and Daniel's personal guarantee on the renovation loan. Everything came from official, joint, or public records I was allowed to access. There were no secret recordings, stolen messages, or hidden diaries. It was all the kind of paperwork a clerk could stamp and a judge could rely on. The day before court, Tessa let me sit in the empty courtroom for a few minutes. She wanted the room to feel less unfamiliar. The heating unit along the wall clicked and groaned. The benches were hard beneath me. Tessa explained the real plan. "When they ask for the house, don't fight them," she said. "When they ask for the marital property, let them take it. Sign over your interest." I stared at her. She gave me a small smile. "Trust me, Nadia. The worst result for them is getting exactly what they requested." I looked toward the judge's empty bench and felt a calmness I hadn't known in months. I finally understood what my mother had been trying to tell me. There was one last attempt to pressure me before the hearing, and it revealed what Daniel and Paul truly wanted. Paul sent over a settlement proposal. It was presented as a compromise. If I signed away my interest in the business and allowed it to be divided, they would supposedly reduce the amount of spousal support they pursued. They might even let me keep the older vehicle. It sounded generous. It was a trap. The company was already mine as separate property. The law protected it because I had created it before the marriage and kept it separate. The only way it could be placed into the marital pool was if I voluntarily signed it over. They couldn't take Hale Ledger Services. They needed me to surrender it. During the meeting, Paul pushed the documents across the table. "It would show good faith if you also handed over the office key while everything is being sorted out," he said. I reached into my purse out of habit. My fingers found the worn steel key I had carried through all those early mornings. Then I withdrew my hand. "No," I said, "not that." Paul's smile disappeared for just a moment. He hadn't expected the quiet woman to refuse. I left the papers unsigned and walked out with my key still in my pocket. The entire plan depended on me being too frightened or too exhausted to read what they gave me. They had chosen the wrong person to hand paperwork to. I made my decision. I would not fight for Maple Street. I would not contest the marital property they were so eager to receive. I would let Daniel take the house, the vehicles, the furniture, and all the debt attached to them. What I would protect was the company, the inheritance, and my children. Tessa confirmed that the approach was legally sound. We would surrender the property that was underwater, preserve what was separate and valuable, and focus the custody argument on the stability I had provided. It was surrender on paper, but it was strategy. I won't pretend it was easy. Walking into court prepared to give up the house where your children grew up requires a particular kind of courage. That night, I stayed at my mother's house. I opened the blue ledger and studied my father's handwriting beside the deposit records. The entire defense had been prepared years earlier by a man who had once lost everything because he had nothing written down. The next morning, I would hand the Rourkes the prize they believed they had won. I barely slept. The children were in the room down the hall, and I spent the night rehearsing the calm, polite voice Tessa wanted me to use. Around 2:30, I stopped trying to sleep and went into the kitchen. I opened the ledger again. The inheritance account had been untouched for 6 years, and every entry was still supported by the same clear trail. I rubbed the steel office key between my fingers and thought about Maya asking whether we would live in a car. I had promised her a home. I had started a business in a garage with a defective calculator. I knew how to begin with little and create something stable. By sunrise, fear was no longer the only thing I felt. I was prepared. I wasn't going to compete with the Rourkes by being louder or angrier. I was going to enter the courtroom with a folder of certified records, a low voice, and the key to the one thing they could never claim. I only had to keep my hands steady. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled like disinfectant and vending machine coffee. The Rourkes were already waiting. They looked confident, almost celebratory. Miriam sat upright in her best coat, speaking to anyone who would listen. Daniel stood with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man waiting to collect something. Serena had come too. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered something about the blinds. Paul shuffled his papers with the confidence of someone who had not studied them closely enough. I sat on the bench beside my mother. The old heating unit clicked and groaned nearby. My heart was beating too hard, so I concentrated on the steady rhythm of the machine and matched my breathing to it. My mother took my hand. Then she leaned close and whispered the 2 words I had been waiting weeks to understand. "Take it." That was all. She wasn't telling me to surrender. She was telling me to let them claim the exact things that would destroy them. The courtroom doors opened. The bailiff announced the case. I stood, smoothed my gray dress, and went inside. I gave them what they came for. When the judge raised the issue of the marital home, Paul began his prepared argument. I nodded to Tessa. She stood and said, "My client does not oppose Mr. Rourke retaining the residence. She is prepared to transfer her entire interest in it." Paul stopped. He had prepared for resistance and found none. Daniel looked at his mother. Miriam's face shifted into something close to satisfaction. The property list continued. The vehicles would go to Daniel. So would the furniture, the appliances, and everything inside the Maple Street house. Even the remaining joint savings, already nearly depleted, would be assigned to him. I signed each document without protest. With every signature, the Rourkes became more pleased. Miriam reached over and squeezed Daniel's arm. Serena sat straighter in the gallery, already deciding how the rooms would look. They believed I had finally collapsed. They thought the gossip and legal pressure had worn me down until I was surrendering out of defeat. I let them believe it. When Paul tried to include Hale Ledger Services, Tessa submitted the company formation papers and the supporting records. The judge reviewed them briefly and moved on because there was no serious argument left. The inheritance had never been part of the marital property. It remained mine. Throughout the hearing, I kept one hand in my lap. The steel key rested inside it, warmed by my grip. They could take the house they saw. They couldn't take the business they had never built. Daniel, Miriam, and Serena signed the property agreement before the appraisal and debt figures were entered into the official record. They were smiling when they signed it. That was the point. Then Tessa stood to address the financial evidence, and the mood in the room changed. She began with the certified history of my inheritance account. It showed the money arriving from Harold's estate and remaining separate for 6 years. No marital deposits had ever entered it. Under Indiana law, she said, the tracing requirement has been satisfied. The records show exactly where every dollar came from, and that none of it was blended with marital funds. The judge reviewed the documents and confirmed that the inheritance belonged to me. Next came the company records, the single-member LLC formed before the marriage, along with 11 years of independent books and tax filings. Hale Ledger Services was also separate property. Paul shifted in his chair. Then Tessa turned to Maple Street. She submitted the refinance documents, the home equity line Daniel had used before filing for divorce, and the appraisal showing the home's current value. The figures were read into the record. The equity was gone. The debt exceeded the property's worth. Finally, Tessa presented the personal guarantee Daniel had signed for the loan, funding his renovation venture with Serena. His signature made him personally responsible for that debt, which was now tied to the very property he had just accepted. Tessa placed the final document on the table. My client has no objection to Mr. Rourke receiving the home and all obligations assigned to it, she said. The courtroom went still. Paul snatched up the appraisal. As he read it, the certainty left his face. Daniel leaned over his shoulder, and the color drained from him as the truth finally reached him. The house he had fought to obtain was a financial anchor. The debt he had hidden was now his responsibility under the agreement he had signed. He had received everything he demanded. He had also received a mountain of debt secured by his own name. I said nothing. The documents were clearer than any argument I could have made. The judge looked toward the Rourke side of the courtroom. That was when Miriam lost control. She stood before the judge had finished speaking. Her gentle church voice was gone. She turned on Paul first. "How did you miss this?" she demanded. "What were we paying you for?" Paul tried to explain something about disclosures and the order of the documents, but his papers seemed to scatter in his hands. Then she faced Daniel. She called him careless. She said he had let Serena lead him into a disaster. She accused him of costing the family its home and attaching a debt to himself that no one in the Rourke family could carry. Daniel turned toward the gallery, searching for Serena. Serena was already standing. The property she had helped him fight for was buried in debt, and Daniel was now attached to a loan he couldn't pay. He was no longer the secure investment she had expected. She moved toward the courtroom doors. The judge called for order. The bailiff stepped forward. The entire Rourke side of the room dissolved into the kind of public scene Miriam had spent 10 weeks accusing me of creating. I remained seated. I didn't gloat or raise my voice. There was nothing left for me to say. The records had already said everything. When the room settled, the judge moved to custody. The guardian ad litem's report was direct. Throughout the divorce, one parent had kept the children in the same school, followed their regular schedule, and protected their daily life. The other had offered expensive distractions and spent more and more time living out of a suitcase with a woman the children had only met a few times. Primary custody went to me, with standard visitation for Daniel. The tension I had been carrying finally released. Maya and Owen would remain with me. I had promised Maya they would always have a home, and now I could keep that promise. I had barely spoken in court. I didn't need to. The important things had been recorded years earlier in a blue ledger at a kitchen table. My father had been right. The person making the most noise often had the least to support the argument. Serena didn't even wait for the parking lot. I saw her through the hallway windows as I gathered my things. She confronted Daniel outside, but whatever he said, she didn't stay to hear it. The house she had helped him pursue was worth less than the debt attached to it. Daniel himself was now tied to a loan he couldn't pay. Serena knew the difference between real money and the appearance of money. She understood the situation in less than a minute and walked to her car without looking back. The fear she had described to me in the grocery store, the fear of reaching her age with nothing, had become the result of a decision she had made knowingly. Then Miriam approached me in the hallway. Her composure had returned, but it looked hurried and fragile. She slipped back into her reasonable church voice and suggested that perhaps we could reconsider parts of the agreement. Maybe I didn't really want the house and its problems. Maybe we could reach some kind of family arrangement. I closed my hand around the steel key. "No, Miriam," I said calmly. "I'm keeping what I built. You can keep what you fought for." I picked up my folder, took my mother's arm, and walked out. The heater continued clicking behind us. My mother waited with me at the top of the courthouse steps. Neither of us cheered or cried. She gave me one small nod, and that was enough. I thought about Harold's old partner, the handshake that had left him with no proof, and the ledger he kept afterward, so his daughter would never experience the same kind of loss. I had followed his rule for years without knowing I would need it. That day, it stood between me and ruin. Behind us, the Rourkes were still arguing in the courthouse hallway. Ahead of us, Maya and Owen were waiting at my mother's house with the hallway lamp turned on. I walked down the steps. I had entered the courthouse expecting to lose everything. I left with the only things that had ever truly belonged to me. The consequences arrived slowly, then all at once. Within 10 months, Daniel could no longer carry the Maple Street mortgage and the other debt assigned to him. The bank began the process, and the home where my children had grown up was sold through a short sale for less than what was owed. The personal guarantee followed Daniel into his credit history and his future. Serena's renovation venture collapsed. The partnership ended, and she moved on to whatever came next. Miriam's campaign eventually turned against her. People in Belhaven remembered what she had said, and once the documents became known, they understood who had actually caused the damage. The food deliveries slowed. The seat beside her at church was often empty. As for me, I kept my office. Some clients who had pulled away during the gossip eventually returned, looking embarrassed. I accepted them without making an issue of it. Resentment is another kind of debt, and I had no intention of carrying it. Within the year, I bought a modest house on the east side of town using my own separate, traceable money. Maya chose the color for her bedroom. Owen claimed the yard for the dog he hoped we would get someday. Every night, I left a lamp on in the hallway. For the first time in years, the home it lit belonged completely to us. People still ask about the divorce, carefully, as if they aren't sure whether the wound has closed. They ask whether I lost everything, the house, the marriage, and the respect of the town. I give them the same answer every time. I let them have it all. The house, the vehicles, and the entire pile of debt Serena had already begun imagining with new blinds. None of them understood what their prize would cost. I keep my boundaries with the Rourkes polite and firm. Daniel sees the children according to the schedule. We do not discuss blinds. Miriam once told a room full of people that I would be lucky to keep my maiden name. I still think about that because of how completely wrong she was. The name Hale is on the glass of my downtown office. It appears on my children's school forms, on the deed to the house I purchased myself, and in the blue ledger my father gave me when I was 17. I didn't merely keep my maiden name. I kept everything that name represented. Leaving a marriage with fewer things in your hands does not always mean you have less. Sometimes it means the things you kept are finally, completely yours. That is what happened to me. A short whisper from my mother, a ledger my father taught me to maintain, and a courtroom full of people who fought to receive a debt. If this reminded you that careful records can matter more than loud accusations, keep your own paperwork and protect your own name. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe.